Now that the October 2019 Heartland Historical Society of Hartland's business meeting has ended, we will move on to our presentation, The One-Room Schoolhouse. What was it really like? And being presented by Mike Day. Mike Day is a retired elementary school principal and a former college instructor who is now the curator of the Barb Hampstead Historical Society's one-room schoolroom. He has authored numerous articles, both print and digital, relating to this and 19th century education. Mike, we are all ears to learn about one-room schoolhouses.
Okay.
Mark, do you need him to pick up this? Is it a test? Is it on?
Well, we will find out in a moment.
So if we give Mike a moment, he's going to get that slideshow going.
Look at that.
All right. Yeah. So just watch your wire. I guess down here, right?
Watch all the wires. Okay, yeah. Well, I'm delighted to be here. If anybody needs to move up to the front row, now would be certainly a good time. Okay, so this is the South Hollow School. As it looked probably in about the 1920s. For most of our history, most of the people in this country got their entire education in one-room schoolhouses, very much like this one. Every neighborhood had one. In 1860, there were over 1,800 one-room schoolhouses just in Connecticut. There were 8 of them here in Heartland. There were 9 of them in Winchester. Up or down?
A little louder, Maya, for us.
How's it going?
For the recording, but we need you louder for us.
All right. Okay. Anyway, there were 8 one-room schoolhouses here in Heartland. There were 9 of them in Winchester. There were 11 in Colebrook. And there were 13 in Norfolk. And until well into the 1940s, I'm getting confusing signals from everybody here. Okay? We're okay? We're doing it. All right. Until well into the 1940s, there were dozens of one-room schoolhouses in use all over this state. Still, the last one-room schoolhouse in Connecticut actually be used as a public school closed in, any guesses?
1968.
Very close. 1967. Yeah, good guess. Yeah, Gaylorsville. The Gaylorsville School down in New Milford. That was the last operating one-room schoolhouse in Connecticut. Now, most of those old schoolhouses have been lost. There are, however, a few that have been restored as museums. For example, there's this one. This is the Barb Hampstead one. This is the one-room schoolhouse, Center School in Barb Hampstead. Open during the summer, every Sunday afternoon. This, of course, the Rock School over in Colebrook. The Little Red Schoolhouse in Norfolk. The Cooley School down in Granby. These are all restored as little museums. They are used by the local schools to varying extents. How much of it's open to the public, that's a whole nother story. That I don't know. But what I want to do today is I want to talk about the questions that people tend to ask when they're going to one of these one-room schoolhouses. What do they want to know? You know, questions like, where are the other schools in town located? How long was the school year? How big was the class? How do you organize the lessons? Was discipline as harsh as been portrayed? And, you know, a variety of other things. Now, obviously, the answers are going to change from year to year and from town to town. But I want to give you some sort of general ideas of what those answers would be, and at the same time, mention a particular resource that you can get back to if you want to do a little bit more research of your own on your particular schools. And in the process, address that really basic question, what was the one-room schoolhouse really like? Well, the first and the most obvious question, of course, would be, where were those schoolhouses? You know, I mentioned there's, 8 of them in Barb Hampstead and Heartland. Where would they be? And to answer that question, I would look first at this. Now, many of you recognize that. That's the map of Heartland from the 1867 atlas of Hartford County. Now, there's an atlases for each of the counties, and therefore there are maps like this of every town in Connecticut. And, you know, if you're a local, you can kind of look at it, you recognize the basic outline of the town. Yeah, there's a reservoir in the middle now, but aside from that, you might recognize some of the roads in there. But the first thing that you notice are all those little blocks of color. And those little blocks of color are each independent school districts. School society is the more proper name of it. Each one of them had its own schoolhouse, set its own taxes, made its own rules, established its own calendar, its own curriculum, hired its own teacher. Totally independent of the town and of each other. There was, however, a town-wide group that were called the school visitors, who would provide a certain limited amount of state money and would approve the qualifications of teachers. But for all practical purposes, each of those districts that you see there were separate independent school districts. Now, if you look closely at that map, usually towards the center of each district, you'll probably find a schoolhouse. Now, if you look closely at these maps, you may know a little bit of something about them. They're really kind of fun. They don't name the streets, but they show the houses, and they tell you who lives there, which is kind of fun, because if you want to know who lived in your neighborhood, maybe even lived in your house, you know, back in 1867, that's going to tell you. But there you see, you know, some of the schoolhouses. Now, when you look around, almost every district has its own one-room schoolhouse. Almost. Because when I look at it, down here in that bottom corner, back on the southwest corner, I don't find a schoolhouse. And I don't know why. Now, there could be a number of good reasons for that. One being that school did not necessarily mean schoolhouse. School was conducted in private homes, in a church, in somebody's barn, any of a number of different places in addition to a formal schoolhouse. Second possibility, schools didn't necessarily work every year. If there were a limited number of kids in that particular district, they might just discontinue school for a year or so and send those kids to a different school district. Often there would be what was called a union district, which was a long-term formal agreement between two districts, sometimes even in two different towns, to have a union school or one school for both districts. Now, if that southwest district down there, if that were part of a union district and the union school was on the other side of the town line, it's not going to show up on this map. So, you know, there's a number of different possibilities. The other possibility is that those crusty old Yankees might have gotten together one day and said, "The heck with the state, we're not having school this year. It's a waste of money." In 1860, there were 50 districts around the state that just simply did not bother to have school. And 2 of them were in Heartland. I don't know that anybody did anything about that. But there was this relationship. You know, kids didn't necessarily go to school right where they lived. You know, for example, here's a document. This is a list of the kids who were from Hartland who were going to school in Riverton. That was the closest school for them. Here's another document, a bunch of the kids who were going to school in northwest part of Barb Hampstead in the Northwest School. At the end of the year, there'd be an accounting. We'd figure out how many kids from each town went there, work out the budget, and town would get a bill. So that's basically how these types of things were organized. Now, having a map, you know, like this is a real good place to start, obviously. But the people really want to know, how does the thing work? What's the organizational kinds of things? Well, the first thing you look at is, why are there so many school districts? Well, the reason, of course, is that kids had to walk to school. There were no school buses. They didn't plow the roads. Now, there's a limit to how far you can reasonably expect some kid to walk to school on a winter morning, even these tough farm kids. And in the 19th century, that standard was about a mile to a mile and a half. Therefore, you got to have a whole bunch of little schools spread around town so that the kids can, in fact, walk to school. Beyond that, there's some other kinds of questions about the organization. And to get into that, I want to mention a very good resource that some of you may or may not be aware of. The reports of the Superintendent of Hartland Schools. Starting in the 1840s and going into the 1920s, the agency that became the State Board of Education every year sent out a questionnaire to every town and asked an awful lot of questions about the state of education in that town. The information was put together and it was issued as a book to the legislature. You'll find one of these every once in a great while. I found this in a used bookstore. But the whole set is in the state library, open stack. You can go down there and you can pull the information from any year, from the 1840s to the 1920s. All kinds of stuff, populations, taxes, how many boys, how many girls, what was the teacher paid, all sorts of information. And you can track not just education, but the history of your community in these books. So a very, very good resource. I'm going to use just one particular year, 1860, nice round year number. Could have used any year at all, but just as for points of conversation, I'm going to talk just about the 1860. Let's see. Okay, stuff we can find out. Whoops. Oh, in amongst the data is some wonderful quotes. Here's a great quote from the school visitors in Heartland. What does he say? Our center schoolhouse is good, comfortable, convenient without and within, furnished with outhouses. 3 others are substantial without, but no conveniences within, no outhouses. The 5th is a miserable thing, without and within, no outhouses at all. A distillery is nearby, which is the better building. So that is the state of education in Hartland in 1846. You don't find that for every year, and you don't find that for every town, but when you do, it gives you a wonderful insight into what was happening locally. So it's really kind of worthwhile in that respect. Okay, so one of the other questions that we can kind of look at, 1860, how long was the school year? That's a very common kind of a question. And to answer that particular question, we'll look at one of the charts. This is how the charts are printed in this particular book. All of the towns in the county and all kinds of stuff. So what do we know? The number of districts, the number of schools, the average length of the winter term, the average in the summer term, how many boys, how many girls, how average attendance, all that stuff. And there's 4 or 5 other pages like this of other kinds of data. Now, first thing to notice is it speaks of a winter school and a summer school. Up until the 1880s, the schools had 2 separate terms. There was a winter term that started right after Thanksgiving. And you probably can't see it from there, but it would run, according to this, anywhere from about 14 to 20 weeks. Then there'd be a break, and then there'd be a summer school, about the same length of time. You could go to either, you could go to both. They were totally separate kind of things. But what does it really look like in terms of local? Here's what it looks like. Okay, in Hartland in 1860, you had a summer school of 15 weeks, you had a winter school of 15 weeks. Okay, 30 weeks total, 150 days. Compare that against some of the others around town. Barb Hampstead had 158 days. Colebrook had 145 days. Norfolk, Norfolk, 140. But Winchester, 170 days. Bridgewater, 200 days. Roxbury, 205 days. And that is not unusual. If you look through these reports, you'll find that many, many schools in Connecticut, and traditionally most schools in Fairfield County, routinely had a high 200-day school year. Many schools in Connecticut have had a longer school year in 1860 than they do today. Because you have this great difference in things. In 1880, the state mandated that school must be in session at least 180 days. That was just to bring everybody to a decent average. But it became the standard. And we have not really varied from the standard all that much ever since. Okay? And of course, what's fun, we still have people out there saying, yeah, 180 days is a very appropriate school year for the 21st century. But it is what it is. Okay. As I mentioned, the kids can go to either session, go to either the summer, the winter, or both. But the reality of it was, you had more boys in the winter session than you had more girls in the summer session. Because you got it. Here's your attendance. Okay, so in Heartland, in the winter term, you had 68 boys going to school. In the summer term, you had 44 boys going to school. What was that, about 25%, 35% of your boys dropped out of school? For the very reason that you had just mentioned. They had to work on the farm. On the other hand, you had more girls starting to go to school. In Hartland, not that many more. It goes up from 44 to 45 girls. It goes up a little bit. But what was really happening there was the girls would go to school during the summer because they were not that much use in the fields. And they would take their little kids with them. So school became a form of community daycare. When the harvest was in, at Thanksgiving time, you had the winter session. Now the big boys go to school because there's less work to do on the farm. But at the same time, because you got to walk to school, that snow and the harsh winter weather, that kept the girls and the little kids at home. So you had the boys at the winter and you had the girls pretty much in the summer. All right, so how many kids are we talking about? Well, within your district, within that particular school district, the school would take anybody and everybody that cared to show up. Kids would usually start at about 5 years old, and they could continue really as long as they wanted to, which operationally meant probably about 11 years old, 11, 12 years old, tops. You could go longer. You could stay right through adulthood if you were really interested, and I know some stories of people who have done that. And you would just kind of keep going to school until you had enough of school, and that's the time that you pretty much quit. How big were the Heartland schools? Well, there's one of them. You can kind of look at that picture. What's that? East Heartland School. You look at the size of those kids. You can get kind of a sense of, the different ones. I mean, you got this little guy here, you look at this big kid here over on the side. Here's some specifics. Center District had 31 kids. Northeast, 14. Southeast, 37. Southwest, 10. South Hollow, 18. West Hollow, 18. 12, 26, 13. So, what do we have? So we got class sizes that run anywhere from 10 to 37. In a one-room schoolhouse. But this is registration. It's not attendance. and there was a world of difference there. There were laws that required kids to go to school at least 60 days per year. How well that was enforced is a whole nother question. A lot of kids just simply did not bother to go to school, and their parents did not bother to send the kids to school. It was a long-term problem, not only here, but everywhere. There were no child labor laws in those days. So, for most of the 19th century, you would have kids who were 9, 10 years old working long hours in a factory job or in a mine. Employers were supposed to check on that. So employers were expected to have this particular certificate for each employee. And what it says is, town, this certifies that the kid has attended full-time 60 days from here to here and is legally allowed to be employed. Had to be signed off by the teacher and the school visitors. Now, you can do this in the city factory. It's a whole lot harder to do this on the family farm. How do you really monitor that? So a lot of kids just didn't really go. Even accounting for a lot of absenteeism, class size could be very, very large, as you've seen there, particularly in the cities. It becomes then a policy decision on your local board. How big a class are you willing to have? Back in the 1870s, the state of Connecticut sent out a nice little booklet that had floor plans for new schools, 1, 2, and 3 room structures, so that if you were building a new school in town, you'd be able to choose the appropriate school. Well, before you can make that decision, you have to make the policy decision of how many kids do you really want to have in a class. And the Commissioner of Public Education offered this piece of advice. Not more than 50 pupils can be most successfully taught by one teacher. That's Beardsley Northrup, Secretary of the Connecticut Board of Education. So with that for guidance, you would then choose a new school building. All of which brings up a whole other question, and then that is, with that kind of a large class with irregular attendance, so many different age groups, how do you manage that? Here's how. Here's a famous painting. This is a Winslow Homer. It's called Country School. Some books listed as New England Country School. And it shows a teacher at work. And the first thing that she did was she divided the group up into classes, essentially more or less academic equals, okay? So she's got these boys over here, and she's got this, little younger girl, the little kids are down here. So they're set up more or less at the same academic level. And she's fortunate in that she can spread them out around the building. And the way that she's teaching is she is now working with these guys down here. She's going to work with them for about 10, maybe 15 minutes. She's going to give them an assignment. They're going to turn around on the other side of this bench, and they're going to lean against this, which was called the writing bench, which goes all the way around the room, and that's where they're going to do their assignment. Let me share with you a comment on schooling of that type. This is from Winchester. So this would be a very typical thing that you could say probably of your schools also. The Winchester visitors said, "It is deeply regretted that no more attention has been paid among us towards providing suitable buildings for the accommodation of schools. The general plan of all the schools in this area is the same. Writing desks are placed against the room, against the walls, all the way around the room. They are generally so high they would be inconvenient for adults, much less for children. The seats in front of these, so the their seats are in front, so the pupils have the option to sit with their face or their back to the teacher. In the former case, he has the edge of the writing desk to support his back, and in the latter case, he has nothing. An arrangement like this is the worst possible. Keep that sort of image in your mind, that picture, because I'll go back to it a couple of more times and you'll hear more references to it. So what looks initially like an ideal school was probably a very uncomfortable one, but it does show how the teacher worked. Now, as I said, she was fortunate she can spread the kids out around like this. On the other hand, if she had a larger class, she, or in this case he, would bring the kids up together, have them toe the mark, and do their lessons over here. Okay? If there were a even bigger class, then the teacher would have the kids come up and surround the desk and teach from there. The teacher's desk in a one-room schoolhouse was traditionally up on a platform. So she was higher than everybody else, so she could see those kids in the back row back there. But how much instruction did the kid actually get? Here's how the day was organized. Now this is a schedule, and you can't read it all from where you are, so I'll read the parts of it to you. This was printed in 1880 in a magazine for teachers, and it is an ideal schedule for a one-room schoolhouse. And it tells you minute by minute what you're supposed to be doing in your class. 9 o'clock to 9:15, you're going to have opening exercises. Not the Pledge of Allegiance, because that didn't start until about 1916, I think it was. But opening exercises would be Bible readings and prayers led by the older students in the class. Then at 9:15 to 9:25, abecedarians. Okay. When was the last time you heard that word? Yeah. Huh? No. Abecedarians are first-year students learning their ABCs. Some books wrote it out as ABCDarians. Abecedarians. Well, probably what we would call kindergartners today. Okay. So, she is going to work with the abecedarians for 10 minutes. And then she's going to go to the first readers for another, 20 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And then she's going to go to the second readers for a bit, and then the first readers of math, the third reader, and then we're going to go out to recess for 15 minutes. Okay? Come back in from recess, take another class, go back to those abecedarians, see how they're doing. Bring the whole class together for a geography lesson. Then take the reading groups out, another reading groups. And at 11:55, you do a roll call. These are farm kids. They have chores to do. They can't go to school until you've milked the cow and gotten the eggs and a few other things. So you're going to have kids coming in throughout the morning. Which is why the classes for the older students, the fourth readers, for example, are going to be later in the morning, because now you're going to pick them up. By 11:55, anybody who's coming to school that day has probably gotten there. All right, so that's when you're going to do attendance. All right, so now we're going to take a 12 o'clock to 1:30. We're going to have lunch and recess. Exactly. You got to go home for lunch. There's no cafeteria. All right. So you're going to have to give time for these kids to go walk home, get their lunch, and walk all the way back. At which point, you're going to start all over again, go talk to those abecedarians another 10 minutes, do a grammar class, some reading, a couple of things. Then you're going to have another recess here in the middle of the afternoon. Keep going. And by 4:30, you're ready to quit. Now, that 4:30 dismissal time suggests to you a much longer school day than you have now, but it's not true, because when you take out the 15-minute morning recess, the 15-minute afternoon recess, the hour-and-a-half lunch recess, you actually have about the same amount of time that our kids have today. So it's not really a longer school day.
Only for the teacher.
Yeah, the teacher's got to be running ragged about that point. And as I say, the teacher's very, very busy, but the kids themselves had very, very little direct instructional time. If you actually go over this and look, the group that gets the most time with the teacher, the most time on task, if you will, are the Abecedarians. They have 4 sessions of 10 minutes each. And that's it. Okay? So what's everybody else doing? Well, they have their assignments. When she works with a group, they're going to work together on the book, and then she's going to say, okay, take the next, 5 pages, memorize this, write that, do da-da-da, whatever. And they would be expected to do that. The assumption is that the kids would keep themselves on task and keep themselves self-motivated, quiet, and busy for the rest of the day until such time as the teacher could get back to them. And that, of course, is the biggest difference between the one-room schoolhouse and the modern schoolhouse, the allocation of responsibility. It was the kids' responsibility to get an education. It was not the teacher's. The teacher was a guide. The teacher, in fact, in many places, they did not use the word teacher. You were not teaching school. You were school keeping. And you'll find many diaries and stories. I kept school for, 2 years. Well, what it meant was that you were in charge of the one-room schoolhouse, and you kind of kept this 3-ring circus going, for a period of time until, you were done. If the kid comes out of here and he can't read, it's his fault. That he didn't pay attention, he didn't work hard enough, he didn't do what he was supposed to do. You never blamed the teacher because the kid was improperly or incompletely schooled. Now that self-reliant attitude was demonstrated and really encouraged by the textbooks themselves. Where did that go?
Yeah, you just go to the display note.
There we go. All right. All right, here's the math book. This is one of the math books that was used in this area. And it is Roswell Smith's book. It's called Practical and Mental Arithmetic. First thing to know is that kids had to buy their own book. School didn't give it to you. You bought it at the local general store, you worked through it, you kept it your entire life, and when you were through with it in school, you passed it along to your younger brothers and sisters, and they used it too. You carried it back and forth to school in all kinds of weather. It got all beat up, and we have a whole set of them back there. That, when you get a chance, I've got about a half a dozen or more books back there from 1846, from a list of books that I know were used in Heartland that year. And it came out of those reports. Those are the kinds of books that would have been used. And you can kind of poke through them, and you'll see they're in pretty tough shape, which is fine, and that's why we let kids go through them, so they get a sense of history. Now, this is one of them. Begins easily enough. There's the one down here, for example. If you have 2 apples in one hand and 1 apple in the other, how many apples have you in both? Well, you're starting pretty basic stuff, right? Notice that the assumption here is that you're already a fairly proficient reader. Up until about the time of the Civil War, there was a strong sense that children below the age of 9 or 10 simply did not have the intellectual capacity to deal with numbers and mathematics. And therefore, it was not introduced at all. So you would have kids who are 9, 10 years old, who could speak Latin and read and all the rest of the stuff, but they didn't know the multiplication tables because they had never been introduced to mathematics. once you were about 9, 10 years old, you bought your math book and you worked your way through it that way.
But did they have as advanced math as we do now? Did they go through?
Yeah,
They did.
they did, in that same book. Now, you'd work your way through it, and there'd be problems, and the answer's right there on the page, so that you can see if you are doing the work correctly. There's instructions down here how exactly to do it. So you could literally teach yourself math. In that one book, about yay thick, you're also going to have bookkeeping and geometry, fractions, all kinds of stuff. One math book would take you probably through freshman year in high school today. Now, you didn't do necessarily all of that in school. It was your book. You took it home. If you cared, if you were interested in education, you would work on that book by yourself at home in your spare time for the rest of your life. It was in the original version of lifelong learning. If you needed it, you went to your math book and you learned how to find area of your farm, or whatever it might have been, because that was your book. The big part of the curriculum, of course, was reading. A good part of reading instruction began actually at home, and here's one of them. Here's the primer. You as the parent buy this thing, you take it home, and you work with your kids at home with this book. And you're going to start with the first couple of pages, which is going to give you letter recognition and a few of the basic sight words. A couple of pages later, you're going to be into syllables. Now you're on page 25, you're into sentences. Now you're into page 45, and now you're into paragraphs. After about 50 pages, you go over it and over it and over it and over it, of course. But after you've done it a few times, in 50 pages, you've basically taught yourself how to read. Okay, now you're ready to go to school and do the other kinds of stuff. That's the whole book. Yeah. Where are we? Lost my place entirely here. Okay. Now, here's another one. You know that one, right? That was the one that was used around here, of course. This was Webster's spelling book. It was, of course, it was traditionally issued with this distinctive blue cover, and there's one over there. It's one of the most significant books in American history because it gave the country as a whole a unified language, not just in spelling, but in pronunciation and in usage. Changed our whole country. Major, major book. Now, you may realize, or you may know, that Noah Webster was from West Hartford. So, a few years ago, when they redid the center of town, they called it, what they call it? Blueback Square. That's the Blueback. The Blueback spelling book. And that's what everybody called it in those days, the Blueback speller. So, when they made Blueback Square, what they're really doing is they're paying tribute to Webster and to his great accomplishment, which was not the dictionary. It was the spelling book. And he sold loads and loads and loads of spelling books like that, and that's how he got the money to support himself while he was doing the dictionary. But that's where it all began, with the Blueback speller. Now, the idea that kids are going to be accountable for their own education, they're going to be self-directed, self-motivated, and keep focused on what they're doing, that's a wonderful idea. It's got a lot of emotional appeal. The downside, of course, is that it gave them a lot of time to get into trouble. And that, of course, brings us to the other topic, which is discipline. And whenever we get kids coming into our schoolhouse, the question that everybody wants to know is, what? Did the teacher really beat the kids with a stick? Yes, she did. Absolutely. But not just any stick. With a ferula. A ferula. Here's the dictionary from 1826. Ferula, an instrument with which young scholars are beaten on the hand. The ferula was a piece of wood. It was probably about yay long. It was flat, had a nice straight edge to it, and whack. However, it also, because it had a nice straight edge, it was good for drawing lines on paper, because paper did not come lined in those days. So, that's the origin of your school ruler. The ferula was the teacher's badge of office. Every teacher had a ferula. But that was only one of the ways that the teachers would punish kids. There's a wonderful book by a gentleman named Warren Burton called The One-Room Schoolhouse as It Was when I went there, or something like that. Anyway, he was a one-room schoolhouse teacher in Wilton, Massachusetts, and he wrote a wonderful, wonderful book, and in it he described one of the teachers that he had growing up, who was noted for punishments. And this is what he says about punishment in the one-room schoolhouse he attended. Some were feruled on the hand, some were whipped with a rod on the back, some were compelled to hold out at arm's length the largest book that could be found, or the great lead inkstand, till muscle and nerve, bone and marrow were tortured with the continued exertion. And if the arm bent from the horizontal, it was forced back up by a tap on the elbow with the ferula. He also had another method. It was standing in a stooping posture with the finger on the head of a nail in the floor. A position not particularly favorable to the health of mind or body or soundness of mind. The head being brought as low as the knees, the blood rushing to it, causing a dull pain and dizziness. And these punishments were sometimes rendered doubly painful by their taking place directly in front of the enormous fireplace. So the pitiable culprit was roasted as well as racked. Another form of punishment, an anti-whispering process. It was setting the jaws at a painful distance apart by setting a chip of wood perpendicular between the teeth. And then occasionally we had our hair pulled or our noses tweaked, our ears pinched or snapped. There were minor penalties for minor faults. Uneasy urchins were locked in the closet or pushed under the desk or sat on the top of it. Boys were made to sit on the girls' seats, amusing the school with their grinning awkwardness. And girls were obliged to sit on the masculine side of the aisle with crimsoned cheeks and faces buried in their aprons. Now, I would not have it understand that this master was singular in his punishments. Such method of correcting offenders has been used time out of mind. It was the prevailing opinion, both among parents and teachers, that boys and girls would play and be mischievous, and consequently masters must punish in some way or another. It was a matter of course. Nothing better was expected. So that was how they did discipline. All right, so what do we know about these teachers? Aside from the fact that you have all these different. There he is with his ferula. So what do we know about them? What training, background, whatever would you need to be a teacher at that point in time? For most of the 19th century, teaching was not a profession. It was a short-term job that anybody could do to get a little bit of income until something better came along. William Alcott, who was the father of Louisa Mays Alcott, was a teacher here in Connecticut for a number of years. He was down in Wolcott. And he said of his training to be a teacher, he said, my training was attending the district school near my house for 3 or 4 months each winter from 4 to 13. I went to the minister for kind of a high school for about 6 months. Made some progress in reading, a little bit in writing, but it's not what it should have been. Nevertheless, I had a reputation of excellent learning. Now that level of preparation was common, particularly out here in the rural areas, until the end of the 19th century. Most teachers had no formal education at all, which meant they taught in the way that they had. Here's one observation from local folks. Our teachers the past year have generally been as efficient as their qualifications would lead the visitors to expect. The old mechanical mode has been too common with the teachers. In teaching, they have been old-fashioned. Still, there's been some good exceptions. So it's not what you'd call, sterling praise here. Most college students taught for a term or two as a way to fund their own education. In fact, most teachers were teenagers. It was not unusual for the teacher to be younger than some of the students in the class. I've got reports and stories of people starting to teach when they were 14, 15. As long as you knew a bit more than the kids in the class, you were okay. You had a good lead on them. It was really a person's first choice. The wages were low, working conditions were awful, and there was no job security. And it was traditional not to hire the same person 2 terms in a row. So absolutely no job security. Yeah, that's right. The system of winter and summer sessions that we talked about a minute ago influenced hiring. For the winter session, when the boys came to school, you hired a man. In the summer session, when the girls were there, you hired a woman. There's some, specifics, in here of how many men, how many women, summer versus winter, and we can pass over that. If anybody's interested, I can show you later. What would happen is, if you wanted a job, you went to the school visitors, that's town-wide group. They interviewed you. If they approved of you, they would give you a certificate, such as this one. Now, this one says, this certifies that Miss Alice M. Cable, having been examined in the branches required, approved as a teacher for Center School District for this term. Okay, 1 term. And this was in March 1903, and this would be, she would probably be teaching the summer session. So that's Alice's license. And here's Alice. She's a Heartland girl. She was from Hartland, and she taught for several years around the area, and I don't know what the records might have been here in town, but I'll bet you a nickel that if you look through who was a teacher in Hartland in 1900, 1905, you're going to find Alice showing up in 4 or 5 of your different schools. She was in Barb Hampstead for a couple of different years. And she needed a new license for each term. In 1893, when Barb Hampstead had 12 teachers, the annual report for the teachers said this of our teachers: 6 of the list of the 12 never before had taught. They were comparatively schoolgirls until recently attending the same or similar district school, stepping from the district scholars bench to the district teacher's chair with little or not any special training for the position. That under the circumstances they had so fair success is more surprising than if they had met with flat failure. So it would have been, pretty much the same thing that you would have right here.
Where did the teachers live? Like, if Alice Cable taught it.
Oh, I'm going to get to that in a second. That in itself is a wonderful story. It was really hard to get qualified people to teach. As I said, pay was notoriously poor, no job security. Community leaders were usually trying to improve education, but of course there was a constant fight with the taxpayers. So, how much did teacher get paid? I will skip the chart and go to the basics, which is this. In Heartland, a male teacher got paid $23 a month. Female teacher got paid $14 a month. And you can see it's the same kind of a thing. You know, in Barb Hampstead, the male got $24 and the female got $13. So you have that kind of a spread between male and female teachers, and that would carry through the whole country, really. I mean, that was the expectation of it. But on that chart that I kind of passed over, and you can look at it a little bit later, there's a little bit of this, the fine print. In the 19th century, for most of the 19th century, and in rural areas into the 20th, a teacher's compensation included room and board. Now, think about it. If you want to get a teacher here in Heartland, there's nobody around, where are you going to get them? You got to bring somebody in from out of town someplace. And given the transportation options, that person has to come to town and live here for the school term. Where are they going to live? Ah, true. There's two ways that was handled. Obviously, they got to live in somebody's house somewhere. There were two ways it was done. One of the ways was that at the beginning of the school term, there would be a board meeting, a school board meeting, and there would be, in essence, a reverse auction where the teacher would be auctioned off. Who will take this teacher? You know, $20, $19, how about $18? Will you take her for $17? You know, all the way down until we can get to somebody, the low bidder, on boarding the teacher. So that was one way. The more common way was a process that was called boarding round. And boarding round meant that the teachers spent different nights in different homes. What they would do, they figure out how many nights in the school term. Okay, how many kids we got in the class? Divide one into the other. All right, figured that out. Then, depending on how many kids you sent to school, that determined how many nights that teacher is going to live at your house. So, yeah, so, you know, the teacher's going to be living with you for 4 days, and then she's going to pack up, and then she's going to live with you for 4 days, and then she's going to go to your place for 4 days. Now, think about the size of those houses back in those days. Huge families, tiny houses, you know, no spare bedrooms. No. It was not uncommon for the teacher to have to literally go to bed with the students. Or, you know, maybe sleep out in the barn, you know. Yeah, really. And I've got a whole bunch of stories of, you know, boarding round. I mean, you know, you read these things and you say, why would anybody do this? You know? But that was called boarding round. And that was the standard everywhere. I was trying to dig up, you know, some of the numbers on, you know, how pervasive that was, and the only thing I could find was they did a survey in 1846, and in Windham County they had 79 teachers in the whole county. 72 of them boarded round. You know, in Litchfield County, 157 teachers. There were only 5 that did not board around. And Heartland was listed on there, and yeah, all of your teachers were boarding round in that particular year, because that's the way you did things then. Okay, what about... Okay, so what did the school look like? What was it like both inside and out? Okay, schools such as the country school that Homeler was painting, or this one, which is one of the what's that, Southwest Parish School here in Heartland, East Heartland. They were primitive. Many of them were kept in use for over 100 years. You know, there's one of these pictures in here that identifies the school as being built in 1822. You know, so there he is. That was one of the schools, and it was built in 1822. It was just kept in use.
That lasted pretty good.
Yeah, it was made out of rocks. I mean, you know, what can happen to rock? Yeah, yeah. I want to mention another teacher who, you know, wrote about. I should say I collect stories by teachers of their firsthand experiences. You know, doing teaching, and I found another one from a local guy. Here's a guy that you've never heard of, but he's a local guy. His name was Heman Humphrey. He was born in Canton back in the days when it was called West Simsbury, and he moved to Barb Hampstead. Bright guy, wanted to go to Yale to be a minister, but that's expensive. All right, so he did what many young men did in those days. He put off college for 2 or 3 years so he could earn money for tuition. And the way he did that was he was a teacher in this area. And he went around, you know, the different schools. Later in his life, after he retired as being president of Amherst College, he wrote about his early experiences, and he described the local schools this way. He said most of the district schools had schoolhouses, but not all of them. The first winter that I kept school myself, notice kept school. Yeah. The first winter I kept school myself, it was in the room next to the kitchen in a small private house. Some of the schoolhouses were better than others, and none of them in the area towns were comfortable or convenient. They were really juvenile penitentiaries. They were small and low and from floor to ceiling, and the calculation seemed to have been to decide into how small a space the children could be crowded until the room was well packed. And not infrequently 60 or 70 would be daily shut up for 6 hours where there was hardly room for 30. The houses were generally square, very narrow entry, large fireplace near the side door. They were roughly clapboarded, never painted. They had writing desks, long boards for writing on 2 or 3 sides next to the wall. Remember that picture? Right around. The benches were all loose, some of them just slabs from the sawmill, standing on 4 legs, 2 at each end. Some a little lower than the rest, but for many of the smaller children, they had to sit all day with legs dangling between bench and floor. Poor little things, nodding and trying to keep their balance on those slabs without any back to lean against. And in the cold weather, it was hard to tell which was most difficult, to keep from freezing or roasting. For those nearest the fire, it was searingly hot, while the ink was freezing in the pen on the back side of the room. For the most part, winter schools were miserably supplied with wood. I kept school in 3 towns, and in only one was there a woodshed. And no wood was ever gotten up in season during summer against winter. Most of what we used was standing in the forest when the school began, and it was cut and brought in sled lengths by the farmers in proportion to the number of scholars they sent. But sometimes in the winter, we went to schoolhouse on a cold morning. There was no wood. Somebody had neglected to bring their load, and we had to adjourn to the next day. The understanding was the larger boys must cut the wood as it was wanted. and it always lay in the snow, and sometimes the boys were sent to dig it out in school time and bring it in all wet and green as it was to keep us from freezing. That was the fuel to make fires with in the morning when the temperature was below zero. And oh, how the little children cried with the cold when they came in almost frozen and found no fire burning. Nationally, schools were a disgrace. I found a report from New York, 1844, the superintendent of public schools in New York, and he said in the whole state of New York there were 9,400 schools, 8,800 one-room schoolhouses. 1/3 of all the schools in New York were officially described as totally unfit for school purposes. Why? Well, of those 9,400 schools, only 1/3 had real desks and chairs. Only 1,500 had a playground. Only 1,000 had separate toilet facilities for boys and girls. In fact, 6,400 schools, 2/3 of all the schools in New York State, had no toilet facilities at all. Not unusual. Remember that first quote that I gave you about a center school? No outhouses? Yeah, that's what was going on here. So you had all these various schools, here in town that didn't have an outhouse. The boys can kind of, make things work out. Girls, it was tough. And this is one of the girls, so many girls dropped out of school. It was because there was just no outhouses. Things were changing. In mid-century, people got concerned about education, in large part because the emerging industries recognized that they needed workers who could read, write, and compute. Industrialists, more than parents, demanded schools improve. Over in Winstead, the first high school in this area, it was established in 1856, not by the parents, but by the industrialists to help train workers. By 1860, there was a bit of an improvement. There is a county-wide report you could look at if you're interested of, rating all the various schools. But, yeah?
Is that school in Winstead the first high school in 1956?
18.
Oh, 1856.
1856, yeah. But that was...
Was that Gilbert? Was it named that then, or no?
No, it wasn't. And it was Winstead High School, I believe. But it was primarily driven because they needed people who could, do more academic stuff. You needed high schools. At that point, you start having, high school being recognized as really important for your advancement in business and industry and society and and all the rest.
And that's why they paid more,
That's right.
because of all the towns
Yeah.
around Winstead paid the best.
That's right. That's one reason. But here's a wonderful comment on the condition of schools in New England. In regards to accommodations, the convicts in the state prisons are better provided for than the dear children of New England. That's Henry Barnard. If any of you ever went to West Central, Barnard Hall, first Commissioner of Education for Connecticut, that was him. Things were starting to change rapidly. People began to realize that they needed better education. They weren't getting it in the local schools. At the end of the 19th century, there was a huge migration of people abandoning farms, moving to the city for better jobs, better life, better opportunities. So much so that there was a very distinct threat to the national food supply. Because if you think, back at that point, you didn't have the high-speed transportation. Cities were fed by the surrounding farms. And a lot of cities were suddenly looking at, what are we going to eat? If all these farms go. Federal government got involved and started looking. When they went out and they said, why are everybody leaving the farm? And they said, because it's not a very nice life. There's no opportunities. They realized that schools were a big part of that, and so this federal government started putting a lot of money into public education. Started a whole lot of different programs. One of the programs was called the School Consolidation Program. The feds would put up a lot of money through the state to build a new school in your town so that you could consolidate your little one-room schoolhouses into one building with better facilities. Those were called the consolidated schools, and there are schools right around here that started that way and in some cases still hold that name. Colebrook Consolidated School, Harwington Consolidated School. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if this one didn't start out as Heartland Consolidated School. I don't know that, but if you look, I'll bet there was some of that federal money that came, into here. At the same time, there was a recognition that one-room schoolhouses, not only are they inefficient, they're ineffective, they waste a lot of money, it's not a good idea. The state got involved. 1909, state legislation passed a rule that said local town government will take over management and control of all public education. The local school districts were abolished, townwide board of education established, and the era of the one-room schoolhouse was over. 1909. I will answer any questions if you want. We can get some to nibble on back there. Those books are available. You're welcome to look through here. Here's one of those books I told you about. All sorts of other odds and ends.
Excellent, excellent.
Very
Very
good.
informative, very informative. Now, before you do stand up and have a little cider, donuts, coffee, etc., I wanted to share a local Heartland story. It won't take long. But it's from 1918, so it's interesting to know. And so I do think that it had to have been at the Heartland, at the firehouse, as we know today. The East Heartland Fire Department was the one-room schoolroom that he had the picture of. And this story is from 1918, so it probably was consolidated at that time and the districts were gone. But this story is from Esther Hayes Goes to School by Sally Jones Lobbin. And this story was recounted to Sally by her mother, Esther Hayes Lobbin. At the time of this episode, approximately 1918, the family of Robert W. Hayes and his wife, Catherine, was living on Walnut Hill Road. Kenneth Hayes was going to start school in the one-room schoolhouse the next day. So Catherine walked the two children, Kenneth, probably 6 years old, and Esther, about to be 5 in November, up to their grandfather's store, the W.L. Hayes Hall. There she bought a pad and some pencils for Kenneth and also for Esther. The next day, the three of them walked Kenneth to school. Leaving him there, Esther and her mother walked back home. Once in the house, Catherine went upstairs to make the beds, while Esther got out her pad and pencil. Esther then asked her mother, who was still upstairs, if she could now go to school. Catherine, thinking she had heard Esther say, "Could I now play school?" answered yes. So Esther trudged back up to the school and walked into the one-room school classroom with her brother Kenneth, where her brother Kenneth was seated. As it was almost recreation time, the teacher picked up little Esther, put her on her teacher's desk, and inquired of why she had come. To start school just like Kenneth, was the explanation. Around this time, the superintendent of schools walked in and wondered what the little girl was doing on the teacher's desk. The teacher replied, she wanted to start school. The superintendent told the teacher that Esther could stay if the teacher wanted to put up with her, and probably this little girl would get tired of the walk to school in a few days. This was not to be. And Esther spent the rest of the year in the front row, particularly liking how nice the teacher's eau de cologne smelt. Esther and Kenneth graduated at the same time from Heartland Grammar School, and they went on to Gilbert. That's our little story. I just thought it was very cute. So stories like this you can actually find in our Heartland Remembers book. There's a lot of personal stories that were given at the time, and Esther actually has like 5 of them in our book. But thank you for coming and supporting us, and I hope you enjoyed it, Mike. That was terrific. So.